The webinar's live.
Thank you very much. And hello, my name's Dr. Wilson. I'm chair of the CCG, and this is the May governing body meeting for Cheshire CCG. So welcome to everybody in the meeting and who may be looking at the recording. This is a meeting which is held in public rather than a public meeting, and because of the COVID restrictions, we are still holding the meeting virtually. So apologies that members of the public aren't actually able to be physically with us because of the COVID restrictions. As a way of opening remarks, I think I said at the last meeting that it seemed that we were in a stage of constant change in the NHS, and that certainly at the moment, that was the last theme of the meeting was one of change, and I was pleased to see that we were approaching that change in a positive way, that we remained enthusiastic about the ambitions we had for the people of Cheshire and how we wished to make sure that those ambitions were being passed forward into successor organisations and successor systems that we were starting to see develop. That theme continues in today's meeting, particularly in terms of the recovery and how that recovery perhaps is moving into different to what we might call transformation, and we're seeing that some of that, and they'll be mentioned in Claire's report about some new models of care work. But for me, perhaps more importantly, is for us to reflect on what do we mean by that transformation. It's a term that we very easily use, and I'm not sure we you know, it can be a bit glib to say, oh, we're moving into transformation. But for me, there is one thing that I think is there. So the involving people and communities was a pillar of our ambitions as Cheshire CCG, about how we thought we needed to recast how we did our business, and involving people and the communities was certainly a very important part of that new vision. So I'm looking forward to that part of our discussions in particular. I'm not going to ask us to introduce ourselves, but if colleagues can introduce themselves as they start to speak, that would be great. Declarations of interest. Everybody has a declaration of interest, which is published on the CCG website. If there's anything anybody wishes to highlight from that declaration, particularly relevant to today's agenda, or anything somebody has in addition they wish to declare now, would they please do so? Nope. Right, that moves on to the minutes of the previous meeting, which was held on the 15th of April. Oh, sorry, my apologies. I haven't done apologies. We do have apologies from Dr. Leslie Atherton, Pam Smith, Ian Ashworth, and Matt Tyra. So then we can go on to the minutes of the previous meeting, which are on page 3 of your pack. So is there anything on page 3 or page 4? Page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, page 9, page 10, page 11, 12, 13, or page 14. No comments? Christine, did we receive any comments in advance of the meeting regarding the...
No, I didn't.
Thank you very much. So once again, you have a full house and no adjustments to your minutes. Thank you very much. That moves us on to 2.1, which is public questions and answers. I'm not aware of any questions that have been submitted. Christine, are you aware of any further, or Matthew, are there any further questions we've had? Nope, thank you very much. That moves us on to section 3.1, which is the chair's report. Oh no, let's go back to do the actions. We're going to do a little bit of a hodgepodge of going backwards and forwards today to make sure everybody stays alert. So let's go back and do the actions, all of which are for me, some of which have been completed. First one is well, actually none of them are completed, if I'm honest. The first one is the resumption of face-to-face meetings of the governing body. We did have a discussion of whether we might be able to do something in June, which might be face-to-face. We decided we can't do that. Our meeting is prior to the relaxation of the earliest possible date for relaxation of COVID restrictions, and we haven't, I don't believe, yet had national say so to hold board meetings in person. There was a requirements for us not to do so, and I don't think that's been lifted as yet. So we need to wait for that, and of course there needs to be the change in the law to allow us to meet, particularly given that they are meetings held in public, and so we need to have facility to allow the public to join us if we're going to hold them face to face. So we can't hold it, so we've deferred June. I think this is a watching brief, and we'll have to see how the regulations develop. We might be aiming for a hybrid meeting, perhaps in July or August, depending on what is allowed. So some people in public, some people in person, some people remotely. So that's an ongoing situation. Action 20, Action 21 is simply me saying, sorry, I missed that. I haven't done it. It's now in chain and will go out in the next couple of days. So that can stay on, so that you can hold me to account for having done it next time. So we can leave both of those on. Right, thank you. Then let's go on to the chair's report. I won't go through every last bit, but I will say about governing body, an update on the governing body GP membership. The application to join the governing body is now closed. Please say we actually have 2 candidates who have put forward an interest to stand with some governing body, and so there will now be a process of voting by the member practices, which I think we're kicking off today, aren't we, Matthew? So that's happening. You can read about the High Sheriff and the Mid Cheshire letter of support, which you're all aware of. You can read about me being the chair of the Joint Committee for Cheshire and Mersey Commissioning CCG and the Commissioning Joint Commissioning Committee. I do want to mention that our Health Inequalities Champion became champions because we had such enthusiasm about being the Health Inequality Champion, and so Chris, Gideon and Leslie are all going to be our governing body champions on that, which is great. Lovely, thank you. I'll pause to see if there's any questions on my delightful report. I don't believe there are, in which case we can go on to Claire's much more interesting Accountable Officers report. Claire.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. As you can see from the report, very long, detailed, but it does represent the outstanding work the CCG is doing in a time of uncertainty and change. So I think I'd like to thank all the staff for their ongoing work and commitment. So don't worry, I'm not going to go through it line by line or even section by section, but will at the end, very happy to answer questions on any of it, but I won't be going through it all. So very quickly, you've got attached the Healthcare Partnership, the Integrated Care System Designate strategy, which sets out the ambitions and priorities for the ICS over the coming years. That has been, a number of partners have been involved in that, and I sit on the partnership board, and the coordination groups have been involved in that, so you can be assured of that. On section 4, there's a very detailed update on the COVID programme. We're not having a separate paper this month, so it sets out a whole raft of work that's going on now in phase 2, which cohorts 10 to 12, new pharmacies being established, having fixed points of delivery across East and West Cheshire, great choice around non-AZ options for under 40s. So lots of really positive work on that, and thank you as ever to Tracy and the team for leading that work. We're changing our COVID arrangements a little bit, and you can see on page 24, 4.6, the areas that we'll be looking at. I want to take the opportunity to thank all the colleagues from the Coordination Centre in Cheshire who've worked remarkably over the past 15 months and done a brilliant job as unsung heroes a little bit above and beyond, and in addition to all the work they're doing. Section 5 on new models of care across Eastern Cheshire. This is very much around looking at alternatives and to support the development of new ways of working in Eastern Cheshire. So we've done work on new models of care. We were supported by the Transformation Unit on this, looking to see how we could integrate services, respond to need, and particularly around those services that were deemed fragile in the acute sector. So some really good work went on with that. We had that work sort of QA'd, quality assured, appraised by the Clinical Senate, and you can see 5.4, there's an attached letter to me back from the Clinical Senate. It actually says in 5.5 that it was suggested we were advised by the regulators, actually it was us that suggested to the regulators that we didn't take this through a formal PCBC process, that we thought we could manage this with our partners through the work of the Integrated Care Partnership and the Place Board. So the regulators agreed with that. We didn't need to take it down a formal process. And you can see in 5.6 what we're asking of our place partners. The world is changing. We know with place-based collaboratives, provider collaboratives, integrated commissioning, and some of the work around clinical strategy between East Cheshire and Stockport. So we'll be working with our partners on next steps around this. I'm going to go on to section 8 around transforming care, because I want to highlight this outstanding work in terms of supporting some of our most vulnerable population and the outstanding work of, you see with a sort of annual update about a month ago or so, and some excellent performance around health checks, and particularly at a time of great pressure for the practices, clearly way above the national target for 2021. So many thanks to general practice for all of that. You'll remember in the past when Tracy presented updates on a regular basis with the table with how many of our population were discharged from long-term inpatient hospitals, and you can see we managed to discharge 18 Cheshire residents since June last year, which I think, again, in light of the COVID pandemic, it's excellent work. And I think testament to the team, you can see in 8.4, 8.5 and over the page, there were really challenging targets around reviews and assessments of residents in institutions, both our residents and residents from other sort of places who were living in our community. And the team managed to, despite the COVID pandemic, continue to meet that national standard, which I think is great in terms of a standard, but more importantly, it's about assuring and providing oversight for the quality of care for those patients. So really massive thanks to the team. Lots and lots of ongoing work, but we want to make sure that this agenda is is really sort of well recognised by the governing body, because it is really important. Section 9. Next week we will have our revisit from the SEND team around 2 areas following the initial assessment visit in March 18, which seems an awfully long time ago. That was when South Cheshire CCG and Eastern Cheshire CCG had different approaches to their commissioning, differentially investing and developing, designing services. So the revisit is around Area 1. You can see the timeliness, process, quality of education, health and care plans, and Area 2 in terms of the lack of effective autism spectrum disorder pathway. So next week we'll be having a joint process across health, education and the local authority. So it's a joint evaluation by Ofsted and the CQC, and we'll be part of that visit. And the team have been working incredibly hard over the past 2 to 3 weeks since we had the call on a Monday morning, when that's sort of give you sort of 2 weeks notice. So the team's been doing lots of work. We have made really good progress, so we're hoping that we'll get a positive outcome from that visit. I'm going to go on to just section 13 now, just to sort of highlight the current campaigns we've been focusing on over the past week or so. Matthew's going to be, and the team are going to be presenting a much more detailed update on engagement and communication. But I just wanted to highlight the 2 campaigns in terms of equality, diversity and human rights and mental health awareness week. Incredibly important campaigns for the population, but also for the staff. And I think we've done some really good work. And so thank you to everybody on that. And thanks to Christine for your talking head. Really important. And I think it was a really good opportunity to launch all the work we're doing about wellbeing and our action plan as well. You can see on page 33 the now regular update on our metrics, our workforce metrics. Since the last meeting, when you asked for further information rather than just a table, sent out quite a detailed email on some of the metrics, and you've got more narrative here this month. But I think the key message for me is, we still have a small number of staff on long-term sick who unfortunately make up the vast majority of those days off. They are being supported through their directorates and their directors, and hopefully, we'll be back at work soon. Whilst, we don't want to sort of look at that in a difficult way, but if you think about the number of staff we have, 334, 200 days off in a month is a lot, but I think it's quite a small percentage, but we do need to focus on our staff and their well-being. And you can see, as I said before, in terms of our equality, diversity, human rights, mental health awareness weeks, we used it as an opportunity to do our launch on well-being. Next Friday, we will, a small number of us, so the exec team, Andrew, and potentially another couple of the governing body members will be meeting the region and the ICS for our annual assessment and assurance visit of 2021. So going back over all the work we've done in the past 12 months in the middle of COVID, but making sure we've achieved all our targets, financial and performance and quality and other. So we submitted a really detailed submission last week, and thank you to everyone who contributed to that. A number of questions we had to complete, provide evidence, and then next Friday we'll be doing a presentation on the work we've done and how we're going to sort of future-proof that as the CCG moves into the ICS. Graham Owen, Director of Performance from the region, will be leading that conversation with us from the regulators. You can see on section 16, I've been to a few meetings in the past month, so happy to take questions on any of those. And then section 17, a number of decisions we've taken under executive authority. Thank you. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much. There's a great deal in there, Claire. So I'm going to ask colleagues. We are asked to note a great deal of your report, but there are areas where we're asked to endorse or approve. Sorry. So I'd ask if we can try to focus on where areas, particularly where we're asked to agree or approve. If there are questions of clarification that can be sorted out outside of the meeting, I might ask that you do that rather than ask every question on what could be an awfully long discussion about this. So, Dan, you want to go first?
Thank you.
So Dan, I'd like to go at the end.
Sorry. So it's Dan Howcroft, the Secondary Care Doctor of the governing body. So Claire, I was just reading the interesting work on the gallery project, and obviously it's great we're getting involved in this. It's great to see that we're trying to address cancer early. I mean, I suppose the jury's out as to whether the outcomes will be as good as we hope they are by identifying these things early. I suppose the question I've got regarding specifically CCG is, are we comfortable? I mean, inevitably this is going to drive some increase in terms of further diagnostics, etc., which will have a additional cost, but also additional burden on a system which is going to be under pressure just dealing with the current backlog. So are we going to be protected, certainly financially, or not necessarily from a provision side, but financially, that the additional costs which may well flow from this study are being picked up by the study itself? And that, what I mean by that is that the MRI scans, CT scans, goodness knows what else happens on the back of some of these tests, particularly given, looking at their website, they're quite clear, they're not very clear on what the sensitivity and specificity is likely to be. So they are saying, well, there could be false positives and false negatives and all the rest of it, without being very clear. So I just want to make sure that getting into this, we don't end up with a bigger cost pressure. That's all.
If I'm honest, Dan, I don't know the answer completely to that. I mean, this is going to be a pilot, and we're putting our hand up to try and have a site in Cheshire. But I think there probably will be competition from other places across Cheshire and Merseyside. So if I'm honest, I don't know the answer, but I would hope, as it's a pilot, all of those issues that you raised will be part of the evaluation before it becomes sort of a recurrent offer to patients, because we can't keep introducing new exciting schemes if it's going to increase the cost. There has to be a cost benefit, a return on investment. So we'll look at that.
Tracy, are you offering to answer Dan's question in the chat?
Yeah, and Sinead may want to come in on the false positives aspect, but there is quite comprehensive guarantees within the study around the provision of the diagnostics for those that take part. So that wouldn't simply be pushed on to local providers. So I think this is really good news. It's exciting, and I think we want Cheshire, as part of Cheshire and Merseyside, to be absolutely at the forefront of this. So it is exciting news. I don't think that there are any issues around us overburdening our current diagnostic provision with that. In terms of false positives and then people being referred through, there's quite a lot of information in there which Sinead may want to give you the guarantee around, that it would simply mean that people would get an earlier referral and therefore potentially earlier treatment. But false positives, Sinead, do you want to come in?
Yes, I've got to be honest, Dan, we don't really know because it's a pilot. So I suppose that's one of the potential risks, but like Tracy said, it's very, very comprehensive plan. The Cancer Alliance are working closely around coordinating this with us, and I guess it's just about us keeping very close to it, hoping we do get a Cheshire site, but keeping very close to it, being aware of that potential risk, as you've said. But it looks like it's a very well planned out study, which is why we're quite keen to be involved. I think that's all I can say at the moment, sorry. But yeah.
I think I would add, I mean, I'm sure Dan would come from both point of views, but from the point of view of the additional resource, but there are danger in a sort of semi-screening type approach, isn't there? That there can be a lot of harms delivered to patients where it seems obvious that it's going to be good and beneficial by finding cancer early, but that really isn't so obvious, is it, with a lot of semi-screening type approaches? And we need, and I realise is it a pilot or is it a research study?
Well, no, it's a research study, sorry. It's a research study. Apologies.
Yeah, I suppose personally I'm happy if it's a research study, because the research is research and will have ethical approval, won't it? But whereas a pilot, is that based on research? Or yeah, I'm with Dan on saying yes, it's new and exciting, but a degree of caution about what we are getting ourselves and our patients into with some of these approaches is perhaps a slightly personal point of view. Thank you very much for that answer. Is that okay, Dan? Yeah, lovely. Christine, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Chris Morris, independent registered nurse. Can I just ask Claire about the ICS health and wellbeing strategy that we're being asked to endorse? Who's the intended audience for that? Do we know?
Partners and the population of Cheshire and Merseyside.
Okay. Do we know if there's going to be a more sort of public friendly version of that in the future? Because reading through it, it's very whilst it's nicely laid out and that, it's very NHS speak. Is there going to be a more sort of user friendly version for our population to be able to get on board with? Maybe
I will ask that question. Sorry, I'll ask that question. I think the view from the partnership board, because it was quite a short document, that was the user-friendly version. But I think there was also some comments from local authority partners, similar to you, that it was NHSy as opposed to system. So I'll ask that question, Christine. I know the engagement and communication team at the ICS are fully involved and have been working with the authors on this. So I'll ask that question later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We seem to have dried up with questions, which is somewhat surprised me. So I'll ask people to stop and reflect. I'm going to in a minute ask you to note most of that report, but also agree and endorse a number of points which are laid out on page 19 of your pack. So if anybody has any questions about that, ask now, or we'll be moving forward to ask for those endorsements and approvals. Okay, in which case, we're asking to note the report. The specific points of endorsement are endorsed. This is the Cheshire and Merseyside strategy, and to endorse its adoption, we are asked on point 2 to note, but also agree recommending next steps on the Yorkshire and Humber Clinic Senate Independent Desktop Review on the new models work, and improve that proposal to be submitted to the Cheshire East Place and Cheshire East ICP for implementation. We're asked to endorse the executive team's support for Cheshire East Council and to commence the public consultation on the Cheshire East final draft all-age sensory strategy. And we're asked to endorse the executive team's support for the Cheshire East self-evaluation framework for special educational needs and or disability. Is everybody content to note, endorse and improve those various items in Claire's report? I'm not seeing anybody say not. I'm seeing some nods. So I'm taking that we are. So thank you very much. Thank you, Claire, for that report.
Thank you.
That moves us on then to item 4.1, which is on page 39 of your pack. And this is the single models of domiciliary end-of-life care across Cheshire work. And Tracy, I believe you're going to introduce this to us.
Yes, thank you, Chair. My name's Tracy Cole. I'm Director of Strategy and Partnerships. I'm expecting to be joined by Katie Whitehead, who's been the project manager on this, and also Dr. Catherine Butler, who's been the clinical lead. But as we're so early on in the agenda and ahead of time, I'll start, and then I'm sure they'll join us partway through so that they can help with some technicalities on this. So I'll trust you've read the paper and just give you a few highlights really. This is an existing spend, and we want to use the money differently to enhance quality, bring about a very small cost saving, but more than that, make sure that we've got a better, more coherent, consistent service across Cheshire. So I suppose I'd just like to bring this to life by explaining it's been, I believe, very thoroughly considered by the Strategic Commissioning Committee as well as the senior leadership team, and also you can see a number of other names on there, so it's been very thoroughly considered. And at each stage, I think there's been very, very strong support for it. If I could just explain what the previous world used to be like, if it was, and then what this will do. So often in Cheshire, if someone requires end-of-life care at home, domiciliary care, there's a number of ways that someone can access it. And then as a CCG, we will often then try to find a provider to cover that care with a variety of costs, a variety of providers, some of whom are not able to possibly support patients in the rural aspects of Cheshire, and sometimes they're not able to respond at peak hours of need. So it can mean that we have a variable offer to our patients and families in what is their darkest hour of need. And I think what we want to do is enhance that quality. So what this will do is mean that we have a single provider that would have the clinical governance of the NHS, so that all staff would be trained to the same level of quality, and that there would be a greater ability to support those hard to reach areas which are more rural, and also that we can make sure that we've planned the capacity for those times where it has been difficult over bank holidays, the summer, Christmas period and in winter, so we can flex that capacity. There is a very small cost saving, but the most important thing in this, I think, is the quality. It should enable people to die in their choice of place, whether that be at home, and make sure that they don't have to remain in hospital and be discharged quicker. So all in all, I think this is the right way to go. We're asking governing body to approve this so that we use the money differently and contract a single provider who would then be held to account to make sure we achieve those quality standards. The discussions when we've had this with local authorities is that they were very interested in how we've managed to achieve this, because this is something that they were looking to do but hadn't potentially managed to do that with the cost savings that also were in there. So I really do believe this is a win-win-win. It would give a streamlined referral process and a whole host of other benefits. So I can see Katie's joined us now. So Katie, I've just been through the paper very briefly and given the highlights, but I know you've done a lot of work on this. So I wonder if it's time for us just to hand over to governing body and see if they have any questions. And I know you've done a lot of work and would be able to answer some of the technical questions. Thank you.
Of course.
Sorry, folks. I was probably multitasking when I shouldn't have been. Have I missed?
I just introduced the paper, Andrew, and said that I believe this is fairly straightforward in that it works through every possible aspect, whether that be quality and provision of service and cost, and that this feels like the right thing to do on many levels. So there wasn't a flurry of hands. I can see there's a declaration of interest in the chat box, which I think is worth noting from Dr. Clark. But I'm asking governing body to approve this so that we can use the existing spend better to serve our population. And I just suppose I'll add to what I've just said is that I think others are wanting to learn from how we've done this, and I think we should be very pleased with our partnership approach to this, which has brought together a number of different players across Cheshire so that we can do this well using all our partners and use that spend to best effect. So I suppose I was coming to the point where I was asking for support or any questions. Katie may want to introduce herself, as she's been the architect of this really important and brilliant piece of work.
Brilliant. So, Katie, I'll let you introduce yourself in 1 second, and then we'll go on to Peter's questions after you've introduced yourself. But just to vocalise Dr. Clark's declaration of interest, which is that she works for the Cheshire End of Life Partnership, which of course is involved, who are involved in this work. So, Katie, do you want to introduce yourself and add anything to Tracy, what Tracy said? But you weren't here, so you won't know what she said. So it will be a little bit of guesswork. So anything extraordinarily important you think you want to add, Katie?
No, apologies. I thought you'd handed it out to questions then, Tracy. Sorry. Yes, my name's Katie Whitehead. I'm one of the senior project managers working within our Thriving and Prevention programme, and I've been taking a particular lead on this piece of work. I think Tracy just articulated all of the reasons why we should be looking to consider how we could use the current spend in a different way to achieve more for patients, both from those kind of non-cashable benefits, and then also there are some cashable savings to be made in there. So nothing further really to add from my perspective, unless anybody's got any specific questions.
So Peter does have a specific question, and as does Fiona.
Yeah, Peter Munday, I'm one of the lay members for governance. I saw this come through the Strategic Commissioning Committee, and I think it's a fantastic piece of work and a really good step forward. My only question would be around how we monitor performance and success. It's perhaps not the right word to use in the context, but how will we know whether we're getting it right? Which committee is going to be looking at this? What metric?
Okay, in terms of knowing that we're getting it right, we have a number of kind of high-level objectives across Cheshire that we're working towards in terms of identifying patients in a timely manner to give them that opportunity to have consideration for their future plans, to then know that that information is being shared across professionals so that everybody is aware of what people's preferences and wishes are at end of life, and where as far as possible we can help achieve those. In terms of committee structures, I think we need to do that work to think how that's going to go through, the best place for that to sit. But there's absolutely a schedule of quality markers that we're looking to see through the delivery of and this change that we're wishing to make, and something that we haven't really have oversight with the current arrangements in terms of the multiple approaches and models that we've got out in the community and the providers that we've got. So bringing that all together and having accountability through one lead provider will bring a greater oversight and a greater assurance from our perspective in terms of our performance against our aspirations for people at end of life.
Thank you, Katie. Can I bring Fiona in with a question?
Oh, hi, it's Dr. McGregor Smith. I'm one of the governing body GPs, and so first of all, thank you for this, and I think that it's definitely a need to get really good end of life care provision, particularly at home, where I think we're increasingly aware that lots of people would prefer to end their lives somewhere comfortable, and that's never been more obvious than in this time of the COVID pandemic. So I'm really supportive of the whole process and the way it's going. I'm slightly unclear, maybe this isn't the right place to ask it, but you know, currently people will be discharged from hospital back to primary care and then sort of taken over from there. So I'm just a little bit unsure about how the lead provider sits with primary care and who would be, you know, who general practice would go to if they want something different done, or would that lead provider be expected to tell general practice what they think should be done? I'm just not looking at Appendix A. I was trying to follow it, and the top line is GPs and the hospital and the hospice, and I'm just not quite sure how where the arrows that go back and forward work. You know, is it that these are more people in the home doing caring support? Is that what we're after here, or is that the basis of it?
Yeah.
So once somebody is discharged, they're sort of back under their general practitioner as opposed to under the hospital, but the general practitioner has access to the increased care, even though they are being employed by their lead employer, which isn't us. That makes sense.
Yes, one of the keys to this is that the service or is integrated with the kind of emerging and in the place setting, the structures. So the service would be integrated with the care communities, and then the link through with the PCNs, so that the care is the care can be wrapped around patients as they're discharged from the hospital setting. So they're picked up, become part of the care community's caseload, and then this need can be assessed and services can be either flexed, changed to accommodate needs if they've changed since the person's had that episode in hospital, etc. So I envisage the GPs and primary care being involved through that care community structure, and the notifications that go through those arrangements.
So does that mean then that the idea would be that a person who is in this situation would have almost like a lead carer, a lead coordinator who would liaise with general practice, liaise with whoever's giving the nursing care, liaise with, is that how it would fit?
Yes, that's one of the aspirations, that there is that lead contact, someone that is coordinating care, that's taking oversight of a continual review of need and being able to flex and respond to any changes in need, either in a rapid, urgent, or an ongoing over the period of time that they would expect to be with the service. But yes, there'd be a lead person taking oversight of the person's care and connecting with whoever they need to connect with, even specialist support to be able to meet end of life needs.
And so, final question: quite a lot of practices will have what they call gold standard framework meetings, which will be held in the practice with district nurses, Macmillan's, GPs, and I'm not quite sure where this sits. Then, would you expect the lead coordinator for everybody to come and sit at all of those meetings in individual practices? Is that how it would work?
I think it'd be based on that review of the list and the prioritisation of people that need to be discussed at the GSF meetings, and kind of that's where people's staging are at. And then yes, of course, if additional people need to join those meetings to support those discussions and make that a truly multidisciplinary approach, then that would be available.
I really support the direction of travel. As ever, the devil's in the detail, isn't it? So just try to make it smooth without making it more complicated, I suppose, is the plea.
Yeah.
Right, thank you, Colin. I've got a number of people who want to ask questions. We've got about 10 minutes left on this item. So just to let you know, we've got Gwydion, Claire, Andy, and Paula to come in. So we can start off with Gwydion, please.
Thanks, Andy. Gwydion Rees, Governing Body GP. So Fiona has really started the questions, and thanks, Katie, for that. I really like it. I think it's really important to have an integrated approach, which is streamlined, that we avoid fragmentation and duplicated care. I think I want to pick up a little bit more on what Fiona says. I think the crux of this is the interface, and most of the cases that I see breaking down are where the hospital to community interface doesn't work. And if there's clearly a need for very quick assessment and input from a hospital to community discharge, I would very much like to see that completely bypass general practice, because otherwise you just shift a job and then you get a delay potentially, and everything starts to unravel. But on the whole, I really like it. Katie, thank you very much, and Sinead.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if Katie was coming back on that. I think it was more of a comment. So should we move forward then to Claire, please?
Thank you. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Tracy. And I know Sinead's been involved in lots of other people. So a couple of questions. In terms of, I know this piece of work started some time ago. I just wondered whether the model had changed at all in terms of lessons learned from the COVID pandemic and any impact on patient care around that. And then the second question was around CCICP as the contract holder through Mid-Cheshire and then subcontracting, just in terms of sort of future proofing for place-based provider collaboratives. Obviously CCICP, anyway, so they're the two questions. In terms of, has the model changed? Have there been any lessons learned during the COVID pandemic? And then just future-proofing the contracting, because CCICP sort of covers sort of central Cheshire, and we're looking at 2 place-based provider collaboratives. Thank you.
Would you like me
before can I see if we can bring in Andy and perhaps have a question response after that, so you've got more than one question to respond to. Yeah, Andy.
Thanks, Andy. Katie, well done. Brilliant piece of work, I'm sure. What I'm interested in, because Fiona has started off and trying to understand the details of the service. And so there's a line within the paper which clearly says that to support mobilization, we need a comprehensive communications and engagement plan. And that's key. So this is a great piece of work, and sometimes things that fall down or don't get launched properly is where the communications with the providers who are integral into this, understanding how we care for patients at this very acute point and where they need quality care. So how are we going to approach that communication so that everybody is aware of this? And therefore, just another plea to actually get this onto some central repository, such as Genio, to actually so people can refer back to this and understand where to go for this type of information that's critical and needs to be timely.
Yeah, okay.
I'm happy to pick up all of those if that helps with, and Katie back me up if that's all right. So I think there's been a lot of questions about the operational, I can't say the word, but operationally, how do we do this? So there needs to be a really comprehensive implementation plan. We haven't gone into that detail in this paper. So if we are to gain approval, I think that's the next steps. And I would like to see how we engage further with GP membership and Senate so that everybody's aware of that implementation plan. And I'm sure if Dr. Butler was here, she'd be able to talk that through in more detail. So we'll be back and asking for your help to make sure that that covers that off, as will our provider. But you're absolutely right. This is designed as, and Gwydion put it much better than I did, to streamline and ensure greater integration and hospital referrals going direct to the provider rather than back to the GP and pinballing around. So I think the devil is in the detail. So if you can leave that with us to mobilise that and work with all sections of our provider world so that everybody's clear on how that lands, I think that would be really important. Claire's question around the impact of COVID, I think, has just brought this into clearer focus as to how much this is required, in that we have struggled at times in Cheshire to make sure that we are able to provide the care that people require and ask for to be supported to die at home. It is even more complicated in Cheshire, and I keep talking about rurality, but that is a major factor for some providers in whether or not they can offer support to some of our more areas that are not serviced as well with transport or take longer to get to. So COVID has made this ever more important to us, I think, to improve this. And also there has been an inability to support patients at times in the way that we would like, with the timeliness of service. So I think this just brought this into focus in more detail. In terms of the provider collaborative that Claire asked around, I think that we need to ensure that this is continued further and handed over in terms of the provider collaborative, so that this is not lost, and that it is about providers working together so that we use that Cheshire pound to best effect. So again, in the implementation plan, I think we need to include that, not necessarily operational detail, but the kind of future proofing as we move into new models in terms of the ICS. So I hope I've covered that. And Katie, didn't want to steal your thunder, but it was just to kind of wrap all that up, if that helps.
No, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think like you say, the whole pandemic has just highlighted, you know, people are choosing to lose to die at home, and in some instances we're not enabling that to happen or people to achieve their wishes. So this feels even more timely.
Thank you. I think we'd all agree. Right, before I move on to Paula, who's having our last question, could I ask colleagues just to focus on page 41 of your pack and what we're being asked to note and approve. We've talked a lot about the operations of it, but actually what we're being asked to approve is the creation of the model, the budget, and the mitigate, and to consider the risks around the model of single tender. So sorry, lead provider. So if you can focus on what we're being asked there, and then if I can ask Paula to ask your question.
Thank you. So I think we've heard a range of views from people thinking about the improved clinical governance of a single model versus actually the detail about perhaps having a single care coordinator to help case manage. So one of the things that I was going to suggest is that actually perhaps a little bit more thought goes into the indicators at Appendix B, which would actually speak to some of the concerns without the governing body then having to get into the detail necessarily about the model. But if we could have some assurance that some of the indicators would not only focus on a single point of getting access into the service, because that's relatively easy done through a single phone call, but I think some of the challenge we're hearing actually is about that care navigator and that case coordinator role. So I suggest that there's perhaps some more metrics that might be helpful and that would give some additional assurance to the governing body. And the other thing I wanted to talk about as well is the phases of some of the key performance indicators, and the very last phase, phase 3, is where we would look to having 90% of people going through this experience. I wonder if we could as well ask for some trajectories as well on that journey. That feels like quite an end point to suddenly get to 90%. So there's something for me about quality improvement speaks to a gradual progression rather than a leap over the line at the end. So I think that would also be really helpful. And then the other thing I was reflecting about was our local authority colleagues in this, and I am really familiar with the dispersed model that we have, and I've been engaged in a number of conversations about this. And quite often when I'm talking to the local authority, we talk about the challenge of retaining a workforce for the domiciliary care sector and the challenges that living wage and pay bring. And it just made me start to reflect, and I'm not expecting an answer now, but there's just a question and reflection for me about thinking about workforce in its wider strategic sense. And I can actually see it's one of the risks that's been listed on the risk sector in terms of being able to secure the workforce. And it's a similar conversation that I know local authority colleagues as well have. So not expecting a detailed response to that, but really important for the governing body to be cited on the fact the wider risks the workforce, because what we can't afford to do is to move people around the domiciliary care sector between different agencies and then perhaps put in through different pay rates, put different aspects of the domiciliary care sector at risk.
Thank you, Paula. Does either Katie or Tracy want to respond to that?
I'm happy to. I think those points are very well made, Paula. So I think it forms part of our future plans, doesn't it, as a system around how we integrate and do these things together. I think what this does provide is a career structure and a career progression for the often under-resourced and under-loved, if you will, domiciliary care sector. So this does do that, but you're right, we mustn't destabilise the market or also create tiers. But I certainly think that this is something that can help an area which I think has often been woefully unattractive for people to go into, and often they don't stay as long, so potentially this would help some of that. But I think that's something that we will continue the discussions with both local authorities.
Lovely, thank you very much, colleagues. I think in summary, I would say I think the governing body are enthusiastically supportive of the work, and thank you for the work that's been done. I think they can see the great benefit in a coordinated service. I think then they're going on to say, can we make sure we capitalise on that and how joined up it is, particularly the interface questions, and a number of GP colleagues pointing out the interface questions with general practice, but how we might use some of the what's in the ask and on the paper in terms of the metrics to make sure that we are measuring something that is meaningful, and patients want to make, people want things which are joined up, don't they, and seem seamless. So I think it's asking you to sort of focus even further on those aspects of the project. So I think thank you very much for that. I'm going to move on to our recommendations and approval on page 41, which are to note the contents of the paper, to approve the implementation of a single model, to approve the creation of a single combined budget, and to approve the actions to mitigate any legal challenges to CCG as a result of the commissioning through a lead contractor approach. Is anybody disagreeing with those points? No. As I look at the chat box, Fiona, have you got a point that's extraordinarily succinct and brief?
So yeah, right. It was largely to sort of just say what we said about the integration there, and that's the key, because if you have two different people each kind of saying, well, it's somebody else's job, or this would have worked if only he or she had done this differently, that's where it will fall down. And so to my mind, this might be where we might want to consider other investment, because this is a people resource heavy thing. That's how people get comfortable end of life care. So I wouldn't want to see any skimping there, but it's all to do with the integration which was mentioned.
Thank you. Is anybody in disagreement with any of the either being asked to note or for your approval of those items? No, I don't believe you are. Thank you very much. We'll take that as noted and approved. And that moves us to section 4.2 of your agenda, which is on page 56 of your pack, which is the Involving People and Communities 2020 to 2021. And I think Matthew is starting this off, but he may or may not be rapidly handing over to other members of the team. So Matthew.
Thank you, Andrew. Matthew Cunningham, Director of Governance and Corporate Development for the CCG. You're absolutely right. I will be handing off to Jonathan in a second. But just really want to reiterate one of your earlier comments at the beginning of the meeting. Really, we signed off our communication and engagement strategy in October 2020, really not knowing what was coming a few months later and how the world changed massively so. However, our commitment was still there. It was one of the, as you said, one of the foundations of the merger for CCG to make sure that the voice of our communities across Cheshire really shaped what we were going to be as a strategic commissioner. And hopefully what you'll hear from Jonathan today and what you've been able to read in the report, and also hopefully on the microsite, will show you that despite all the challenges that we have faced with COVID and restrictions, we've undertaken a massive amount of engagement, and we take a massive amount of engagement in our daily work, and how we capture that and how we then shape that into what we do as a CCG and our partners is really important, and hopefully it's been clearly articulated to you. That said, we don't rest on our laurels, and there's a lot that we still need to do going forward. There's still a lot that we wish to influence and shape our partners going forward. But hopefully you see we've made a really good start over the last year despite all the challenges. I just want to give a bit of a personal thanks really to Jonathan and the team, like Katie and Chris and many others who have responded to some really crazy circumstances, but are really committed to keep doing the business as normal work, as well as a major communications piece of work around COVID-19. So we'd really like to give lots of thanks to the team being able to do that, and all the rest of the CCG who support the communications and engagement team to deliver this as well. Jonathan, I'm going to hand over to you, if that's okay.
As you do hand over, can I just remind everybody that this is a 10-minute item and we probably need a little bit of time for some questions.
Yeah, no worries, thank you. I was going to spend just 5 minutes pulling out some highlights and then on to questions and recommendations. So thanks for the intro, Matthew, which is very much appreciated. Really important to recognise that I'm just the mouthpiece here for a fantastic wider team who've done incredible work over the last 12 months. Admittedly, there was a lot of content for you to look through and take on board. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at and review the supporting materials. Sort of just signposting the key areas of focus in the report itself then. It's bringing to life what's been achieved and what have been the challenges in relation to involving people in our work this year. Reflecting on the ongoing and really positive work we've been doing with our local authority colleagues and the community sector to increase vaccine confidence in underserved communities. Thirdly, the work we've done collaboratively across directorates to deliver a series of insight and intelligence reports. These are really key because they show the public how we've embedded their voice and their feedback into the commissioning cycle. And finally, I think most importantly, looking ahead, how we want to continue to work with system partners to develop and enhance mechanisms to involve people in commissioning, moving forward in both in the integrated care system and in the Cheshire West and Cheshire East places. So taking each one very briefly in turn, I think the Involving People and Communities microsite, usually at this time of year, I'd turn up to a governing body meeting with an NHS glossy brochure under my arm and that'd tell the story of the previous year's work. And at that moment, although it becomes a useful public record of our activity, its wider use is generally obsolete from that point. So what we've tried to do this year is develop a live microsite. And I think in doing so, we've delivered something that's more progressive and sustainable, and we can use it through the remainder of this year to tell the story about our involvement of people and communities. We've worked in partnership to develop and design it, so input from partners, stakeholders and residents. I know that Gus Cairns has been on the call, I think he's jumped off, but he in particular has been really helpful, for example, in feeding back around improvements, which we'll carry forward into the published version. It's mobile and tablet friendly, and we hope you like the way the content's presented, but I would echo Chris Morris's comments earlier that there's still work to do around jargon busting and health literacy to make it really accessible. I'm already talking to partners in place about how we might do the same and recreate similar platforms for Cheshire East and Cheshire West to showcase the work of the ICPs. So if you haven't already looked at it, please do so because there's some really good stuff in there. Moving on to section 3 and engagement with underserved communities. So that bit of the report and Appendix B that accompanies it provides a snapshot really of the work, the insight-led work we're doing with our local authorities in the community sector to engage with marginalised groups, both to increase vaccine confidence and uptake. I mean, were they here, I think Ian and Matt as our Directors of Public Health, I'm sure they'd reflect that all very good, but we've only just scratched the surface and we're acutely aware of that. But I do think it's okay that we take a moment to be proud of what we've achieved so far, because some of the work that's within the report has received regional and national recognition and has influenced communication strategy in the Cabinet Office and Public Health England. So we've set out some bullets which give you that snapshot of what we've done with some of those targeted groups to date, but typically the programme moves at a rapid pace. So there's already stuff to overlay, including work we're doing with elected members in some of our wards with lowest uptake to reach people who we need to come forward and be vaccinated. I think the key takeaway here is that this is really laying the foundation for the CCG and its partners to do some, really good future work around commissioning decisions and addressing health inequalities moving forward. So, I'm really sort of excited by that. Quickly then to section 4 and the insight and intelligence reports. The genesis of our approach in terms of the way we present insight and intelligence that we collect from our partners and we collect ourselves has its roots in the former West Cheshire CCG. So under Paula's leadership this year and under the guidance of the Quality and Safeguarding, which is now the Quality, Safeguarding and Performance Committee, we've worked across directorates to develop the series of insight and intelligence reports in your pack, which we publish on a trimester basis. And they're then used by our clinical and programme leads to inform service design, commissioning and contracting decisions. What's different to previous incarnations and where my team adds value, I think, is in that packaging, that presentation, so that they're really quite public friendly and they're a key part of our engagement and comms strategy, so that we can show people how the feedback they provide us is processed and used. So hopefully the governing body will have picked those reports up anyway through the subcommittee reports from Policy, Safeguarding and Performance, but we really want your support to continue that work, and I think it's got legs in place as we move forward to do something on a place footprint. So I will shut up very shortly, but just before I do, I think looking ahead, I think if we were to hold the mirror up, I think the things where we've fallen short in terms of our delivery around the comms strategy presented in October is that we haven't quite got round to setting up some of the ambitious CCG specific channels we said we might, such as an engagement reference group and a citizens panel. But I'm kind of not beating myself or the team up about it, because if we consider where we are and as we look ahead to the new landscape, I think our priorities would have naturally shifted anyway to working more on a place footprint to develop mechanisms for involving people and communities in commissioning at place and getting people involved in the work of the ICPs. So linked to that, in the final section of the paper, there are references to some of that work that we're already doing with our ICPs around lived experience boards, around transitioning the relationships with patient participation groups from traditionally the CCG into the care communities, and of course building on that great work around the COVID vaccine programme, which has really strengthened relationships with the community sector in place. So that's the canter through. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions, and there are some recommendations, Andrew, that we can consider as well.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I do have a couple of questions. I'll just about introduce those. From my point of view, it'd be really good to hear from Chris Lynch at some point in this. Chris, I want to put you under pressure if you don't want to say something, but it would be good to see, from my point of view, to hear your. You've just put in. Can I come in? Brilliant. So we start off, please, with Peter, and then we go to Tracy, and then we have Chris.
Yeah, Peter Monday, I'm a lay member for governance. Given that we were being asked to approve further work on a microsite or perhaps microsites, I was wondering, first of all, can the public feed back to the microsite? That's my first question. And the second question is, what's the CCG resource commitment to running a microsite?
Okay, so the public, to a certain degree, have already been involved in helping us shape that, because we've used some of.
I think Jonathan's gone a little bit. I need to invest in Wi-Fi. So I'll try and answer a little bit for Jonathan, really, in terms of the microsite is part of a little contract that we've got to manage with the developer anyway. And the content is provided and they do that. So it's not much more than what we do in some respect with our normal website, Peter. I think if I understood your question rightly about how do the public, or can the public feedback, is yes, they can. But the microsite will probably have that functionality to be able to make that a little bit more easier for members of the public to feedback on the areas that we talk about, or even to add to it going forward. But that's part of the evolution, I think, is where Jonathan was going about, really, about that place, is how does it become more of an engagement mechanism rather than a communication sort of forum as well. But sorry, Jonathan, you froze out there, so sorry if I've answered.
Yeah. Apologies, it's raining cats and dogs in Northwich, which seems to affect my internet connection. So I was trying to say that people have already been involved in helping us shape it. That will continue. And in terms of your question around the resource, it's actually cheaper to do this than to produce and print a glossy NHS brochure, which is only as good at the time that you publish it. So it's a much better way of doing things, I think, and I think that reflects some of the feedback we've had.
Thank you very much. Tracy, ready to come in.
Thank you. So I just want to say that I thought it was a really good paper, and I think there's a lot to be proud of. And I would support what you just said around not printing and publishing things on paper. It fits with our climate change agenda, so that's really great. My question, John, was going back to the section that you've included on the engagement with the underserved communities. I know we've done a lot of engagement to encourage people to take up their vaccine, but is there any other spin-offs of that, so that we've got continued engagement around other healthcare provision and requirements that we've made as well, so it's not just a single form of engagement? I'm not sure if you've frozen again, John.
I think he's frozen again.
I don't know what's going on in Northwich, but Macclesfield is also very wet, but no cats, no dogs. So the simple answer is, Tracy, I think absolutely. The work that's been undertaken with these groups around the vaccine will pay dividends going forward in terms of the networks we didn't have before, which we do now have, which would allow us to do other sort of health and care based messages and support. So if it's flu, if it's awareness of other campaigns, hopefully you read in some of the information, just some of the work that was done around the voting community and GP access cards, so linked to the vaccine, but get them registered with a GP, things are going to improve. So absolutely, as Jonathan would hear it say, there is a resource that we have to think about going forward. To create these networks and networks. There are much better agencies than the NHS and the CCG who have reached into these communities, which we do need to give them support to be able to do that. But that's not necessarily a conversation for today, but it is going forward.
Lovely, thank you. We'll move on with our questions, and I hope that Jonathan can stay with us. We've got Chris and then Claire. It will be a closing question for us. So Chris and then Claire.
Thank you. Hi, Chris Lynch, Co-op Diddley member. I just, to reiterate, I think it's great work considering the year we've had, and I think it really is a journey, and I think the way we talk about things, really matters. And I think in the past, even the language we use, I think in the past, the language would have been around hard to reach groups, and now we're talking about underserved groups. So I really think flipping that language and how makes a huge difference. And I think it is a journey, going beyond that traditional involvement, engagement towards co-production. And I think it's not just about hearing those voices, but people being actively involved. So, and I think part of that in the future, is that we were already talking about co-design, and perhaps that co-evaluation, so that residents get to evaluate themselves, the levels of engagement. And I think that, those structures that we thought we might put in place with the strategy, it's more embedding the objectives. And I think, this is a great start. So great work to everyone involved. So thank you, Jonathan and team.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for that, Chris. I think we can move on. If there's any comments on that, you can pick it up after Claire's comments. So Claire.
Thank you. So I guess, as everybody, thank you very much. Really good piece of work, not just in terms of the paper, just the whole year. And I think it's testament to our collaborative partnership working in terms of co-production. The NHS can't do this without local authority, who can't do it without the communities, etc., etc. And it really is a system partnership approach, very much, team, individuals. And I think that's something that we just need to recognise. One of the questions I was going to ask, in terms of the microsite, and I'm not an expert in any of this, just in terms of digital poverty, making sure we have different media opportunities. Appreciate we're not going to print off and have the written word, but just making sure in terms of health inequalities that we focus our work on all communities, so we don't almost increase inequalities by having a sort of technical digital solution for some of this engagement. I know this is only part of it. I just wanted to ask that, but I do think it's really excellent, and I think it really bodes well for the future. And we talk about legacy, don't we, in terms of COVID, some of the COVID work, but this sort of before COVID, has just been exaggerated in terms of all of that excellent work. So thank you very much.
Jonathan, did you want to respond to either Chris's comments or to Claire's?
Yeah, seems to have a temporary reprieve of internet connection, so apologies for the disruption. You're dead right, Claire, and I think what the COVID vaccination campaign in particular has taught us is that the value of the outreach and engagement work, albeit in that context to talk about the vaccination programme, but it's enabled so many opportunities to be seized in terms of every contact counts, that it's part of a wider offer to our population in terms of how we talk to them and find out things and share things with them. So the learning and the story we're telling through the microsite to certain audiences will be retold in different ways to different communities as we continue that outreach programme, which is really kind of set us up really nicely into the year ahead.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So thank you very much to Matthew for introducing it, for Jonathan for the work. I think the governing body remains, I think you've heard the governing body's thanks. The governing body, I think, remains very enthusiastic about this work, and particularly that journey, I think, as Chris said, from involvement towards co-production. And I think we're seeing some of that, perhaps not fulfilling all the ambitions we had because of COVID and now because of restructuring. But what I'm hearing is a real optimism that actually the COVID working with partners has been very beneficial to this work. And actually, I think that probably bodes very well for the work that can be done in place in the new structures about continuing that ambition towards a co-production rather than engagement. So thank you very much for that. We are asked, colleagues, on page 56 of your pack to, on page 57 of your pack, to approve the launch of the microsite, to note the citizens partners work on increasing vaccine confidence, to ratify the approach of embedding the residents' voice via insight and intelligent reports, and to support the comms and engagement team further active engagement with system partners and community sector networks that can inform the influence involving the commissioning at place. I think we can do those things unless anybody says anything different to me. Thank you very much, and thank you very much again to you, Jonathan, for that presentation. That moves us then to section 4.3 of your pack, which is the recovery and restoration. I'm sure colleagues have found this, but in case you didn't, it was circulated separately by Christine Frank on Friday, the 15th of May at 16:24, if you're searching for an email, but I'm sure everybody has found it. And our joint medical directors are going to do this. I don't know if they've agreed amongst themselves who's going to speak first, but it's over to Andy and Sinead.
Oh, sorry, Andy, Neil's going to do the introduction. Then Andy and I are going to be involved. It's going to be quite a big team because we've got 2 of our clinical leads joining us as well. So, okay,
in which case, Neil.
That's okay.
Yes, thanks. I've been asked to do the brief introduction. I'll try and keep it brief because I'm sure you're more interested in getting into the detail with our clinical leads who are joining us to present this. I'd just like to say thanks. As Sinead has alluded to, this presentation is very much a team effort, and due to some of the difficulties of running this online, many of the people who have produced the slides aren't with us, but I would like to extend thanks to all those who've been involved in pulling this together. And as we go through the slides, I think you'll see that recovery and restoration as a title is integral to the plans that we've developed as a CCG and a wider system this year for obvious reasons. So Noreen's going to take us through the slides. So if you want to just move us on, please. So first comment is, the blindingly obvious that we know that we've had a pandemic for the last year, which has meant that the way services have been delivered and also how people have accessed services have changed. And that's led to some transformation of services, and more needs to happen. And some of that will come through, hopefully, through the discussion today. We equally know that has left us with some challenges, hence why we are talking about recovery and restoration. And we know that we're seeing significant increases in need in our population, which is impacting on all sectors, whether that's the number of people accessing primary care, cancer referrals where people haven't come forward during the pandemic, mental health services, and we will pick up on those today. The other thing that has come out of the pandemic, which we've touched on already in previous presentations through today, has been around health inequalities. We know that the impact of the pandemic has really heightened everyone's focus on inequalities. And again, all of our programs are taking that similar focus, whether we're talking about new developments or whether we're talking about how we recover some of the services that we've struggled with during the pandemic period. Thanks, Noreen. Okay. The other thing we equally recognise, and this I guess is one of the real communications challenges that we have as an NHS, is that the solution to some of those challenges that have come out of the last year aren't going to be overnight fixes. And you know, we've seen in the last week or so some real sensitivity caused by some of the national press coverage around face-to-face access in primary care, and an assumption that suddenly overnight everyone who's not been seen for the last year can all get in on day one. Clearly anyone can work through the maths and the fact that we still have infection control constraints on people coming into buildings to know it's not as simple as just what you had 2 years ago is what you can immediately have. And the NHS, along with wider society, is struggling with how we deal with that short-term increase in demand whilst transforming and making everyone feel engaged with the system. And as we've discussed at previous governing body meetings, the NHS planning guidance, and you can see the 6 main categories within the planning guidance at the bottom of that slide, were very focused on both the response to the pandemic, but also how we start to address some of those challenges that we are still facing. Thanks, Noreen. This leads on from there, and it just talks about what we're going to discuss today. So the next slide in a moment, we'll talk about the CCG strategic objectives. And we discussed this at the last strategic commissioning committee. We've gone through a process of mapping the CCG's strategic priorities, which we developed relatively recently, map to the priorities both in the national planning guidance but also in our local priorities, and the pleasing thing is they do map quite neatly and fit together quite well, and we're framing our programs about making sure they deliver all of our objectives and priorities. The other thing that of course is that recovery and restoration of services will cover pretty much every area that we commission. Today we're going to focus in on 5 main areas. That's not to say there isn't work in the others. And the ones we're going to focus on today, as you can see at the bottom, are cancer services, mental health, urgent emergency care, elective care and primary care. And if you just move on to the next slide, then that is the strategic objectives that you all know very well. And you will note that, as I say, we have mapped those into the programs that you'll spot as we go through the slides. So the way we're going to run the session today is our clinical leads are going to pick up a specific area at a time. We'll then pause at the end of each section and allow questions rather than us go through PowerPoint slide after PowerPoint slide. Hopefully that'll give you the opportunity to come in before you forget what you wanted to say about a certain subject area. Sinead is going to go first with elective care. Then I'm hoping we've got Catherine Butler, who's going to pick up cancer services. We have Tracy's going to pick up mental health services. Rebecca Banks is going to pick up urgent and emergency care. And Andy McAlevey, remind me which one you're picking up.
In primary care, Neil.
Primary care.
Yeah, the most
by no means least.
The most important one.
It's the problem when you're flicking the slides on the screen and they're not in your own control. You lose your list. So I'm going to hand over to Sinead at this point, who's going to introduce some of the work we've done on elective care. Just one other contextual thing that we've had a debate about. Obviously, what we didn't want this session to be was a replay of what we discussed at the Quality Safeguarding and Performance Committee, when we're going to quite a lot of detail on numbers of patients, length of time waiting. So there is some reference to that, but we deliberately haven't turned this into a performance report. It's more focused on the actions we're taking. If people want to ask a question about the kind of scale we're talking about, I do have a lot of that information, so I may be able to answer. But I say the focus we're hoping on was a forward-looking program of change rather than a retrospective look at the numbers and the performance of our individual providers. So I'll hand over to Sinead. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. So that was just, I think that was just your last slide, wasn't it, Neil, around, do you want to talk to that, or have you already talked to that, really? Yeah, I thought so. Okay, thank you. Just to point out, so I'm going to start talking about elective care. Catherine is going to follow on afterwards, but just to let you know that her camera's broken. So Catherine Butler is with us, who's our clinical lead for cancer and end of life. So she will still be able to talk to her slides, but that's why you can't see her. So just to let you know. So, okay, so I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the work we're doing around elective care with our provider partners. And our Thriving and Prevention team have picked for elective care, have got 3 big areas of priorities. So the first one is to really look at areas we can work on around integrating our services more. We're doing a lot of work around diagnostics, how we can integrate our diagnostics more. For primary care colleagues, we will know there's been a lot of issues around diagnostics that have been really highlighted during the COVID pandemic. First of all, there's big backlogs in waits for a lot of diagnostics, but also as our secondary care colleagues have been doing more work remotely, there's been difficulties around who actually orders diagnostics, looks at the results, all sorts of issues. So we've got a program really. It's about recovery of diagnostics and reducing the waits, but it's about how we can do things differently and how we can work across primary and secondary care to make our diagnostics accessible to everybody, and in a much more integrated way, as close to patients' homes as we can, as is appropriate, depending on what those diagnostics are, and making sure you've got the expertise you need. We want to reduce inequalities. That goes throughout the whole programme. When we say reduction in outpatients, what we really mean is transformation of outpatient services, but I know we've said before we shouldn't bandy the word transformation around willy-nilly, but we really do mean doing things differently. So we want to meet people's needs, but in the right way, in a more timely way. We don't want people to be brought back to outpatients every year if that's not useful for them. We don't want them to have to wait for a first outpatient appointment if they could have been dealt with in a completely different way. This has to involve primary and secondary care working very closely together, because the last thing we want is one area thinking the other area is dumping on them. So it's very much a transformative approach, working across all clinicians and having the patients at the heart, working out what they need, and starting from there really. Long-term conditions, again, it's all about inequalities with long-term conditions, which if anything we think have actually sadly increased across the patch during COVID. We really want to empower people to manage their condition themselves, and there's lots of good programs going on there, but we need to keep going with that. We can use telehealth, can be very useful, but again, you have to be careful that doesn't widen health inequalities, so you have to be careful how you use your technology to help with that. And we have to look at our prescribing and make sure we're prescribing as efficiently as possible while keeping the quality at the maximum. And then around elective equality, so this is all the rest of elective care really. We know there's big long waits, and I'll come on to that on 1 or 2 of the next slides. Again, our outpatient transformation work is absolutely part of that. We've prioritised some areas where there's the biggest waits, but you'll see later in one of the slides, it's not always those that are the biggest waits that provide the biggest risk, and you need to actually look at the risk to patients in terms of mortality, morbidity, and sometimes in some areas you might be waiting longer, in another area you might be waiting less time, but there's there's a bigger impact on those patients. So I don't think we should just look at numbers waiting on a waiting list, and we're certainly not taking that approach, that simplistic approach. Next slide, please. Noreen, thank you. Lots of information on this slide, so you'll be pleased to hear, Andy, I'm only just going to pull out some of the key points, but you've had the slides in advance and they're there for you as well to look at. And like Neil says, there's much more detailed reports around all of this if you haven't seen any of them that you'd like to. There's a massive wait in waiting times for outpatients, for treatment, for surgery, and the hospitals have all been asked to prioritise those people waiting from P1 to P5, and there's different criteria there. So P1 are the most urgent ones. P1 and P2 are both quite urgent categories, really, in terms of patients having significant impact on their quality of life if they don't get the treatment or the operation that they need. Our hospitals are working back up to trying to get back up to 100% plus of what they were doing pre-COVID. We know that even if they get back up to 100%, it's going to take them a long time to get through those backlogs, especially in those P3 to P5 patients, so the ones that are less urgent but still absolutely need to have their treatment. So there's a lot of work going on with our colleagues to use the independent sector to look at how we can do things differently to work through those backlogs. And we're really supporting our 3 acute trusts with that work as well. We've been basically, looking particularly at the health inequalities that I've said, referral to treatment times. There's a lot more 52-week breaches, which is when patients have waited 52 weeks plus for their treatment. Now, while we do need to focus on those most in need, which is about the P1 to 5 categories, everyone would agree if you're waiting longer than a year for a treatment, that's pretty significant. So we do want to really work with our trusts, and they've got trajectories about getting this down. 52-week breaches used to be quite unusual, so they weren't a common scenario pre-COVID. We did have some. Now we've got quite large numbers in some of the specialties, particularly ophthalmology, general surgery, and trauma orthopaedics are 2 particularly pressured specialties, and dermatology in some of our trusts. Next slide, please, Noreen. Cheshire and Merseyside have a big recovery and transformation programme. It's really helpful to do some of this work at a big scale like that, in terms of resilience, in terms of mutual aid, in terms of using the independent sector in a logical way across a bigger patch. I've personally seen the Cancer Alliance do a lot of good work when they've worked across that big patch. So there are a lot of benefits to this, and I personally would say that it's actually helping us in Cheshire to be part of these bigger programmes across Cheshire and Mersey. So there's things that programme are focusing on. They're also providing a lot of support to Countess, which is probably our most challenged overall of the 3 trusts, although there's obviously differences between the 3 of the acute trusts. There's also lots of work going on to improve the data we get around those waiting lists. So some of the waiting lists are built up during COVID. We don't even know exactly what's in them, and you can't start to work on those patients and work out if some can go to independent sector, which are more urgent, if you haven't even been able to validate your waiting list and see what's in there. So lots of work on looking at waiting lists, looking at what kind of patients are in there, and improving that. PTL work is about improving the data we have. You don't want to spend the whole time providing data and not have time to actually do the clinical work. But if you don't have accurate data, it's really hard to work on the solutions. So there's a lot of work going on around that as well. Next slide, please. You'll be glad to hear this is the last slide, so we've got time for discussion. I think that's the elective prioritisation is part of what I've already said, really. Work carries on to prioritise the patients that are most in need, but recognising that we do need to focus on all of the different groups. So a lot of our trusts, it's going to be a good 12-18 months before they can get back on track to where they were pre-COVID. And as we've been discussing with them, we don't want to go back to the same ways of working we had pre-COVID. A lot of it wasn't working particularly well then. So it's the challenge of trying to get our trust to work on this backlog, but also transform at the same time, so that we can come out of all of this in a better place and more resilient place to deal with our elective care going forward. And the elective recovery framework is a really useful framework, actually. that is used to look at the elective care recovery fund. So this is the money that's been made available to our acute services to try and deal with the backlog and work in a different way. And what I really like is the first two priorities are addressing health inequalities and transforming outpatient services. So, you know, that's music to our ears, really. And then we've got, you know, some of the words like system-led recovery. That's the work we're doing across the whole patch. And community diagnostic hubs are in there, so that we're doing loads of work around community diagnostic hubs. There are diagnostic hubs which are a big piece of work, which is a 5-year plan, which is about moving some hospital diagnostic services out elsewhere, and that will help the hospitals, and it might help you provide more one-stop shops and more coordinated diagnostics. But actually what we're really interested in Cheshire is about our more localized diagnostic hubs, which might be, for example, 1 per PCN, or, you know, certainly 1 or 2 per place, which won't have an MRI scanner in them, but might provide some of that other diagnostic work that we need to do to work patients up and enable things to be more coordinated. So when we talk about diagnostic hubs, we talk about those 2 different work programs, and I think they're both very important in helping us with our recovery going forward as well. So I think I've waffled enough. I know it's a huge piece of work, well, pieces of work, but really keen to see if there's any questions or any clarity required on any of that. Thanks, Andrew.
So there are some questions. So Gwydion is asking in the chat, communications between trusts and patients who are waiting, and giving them estimated times. Is that something that's happening?
Yes. Oh, sorry, I can't see the chat very well. So, right, yeah. So trusts are writing to patients that are in their waiting list to explain to them what is happening. We're also encouraging our trust to provide a point of contact for the patients to ring the hospital direct if they've got queries then about where they are in the waiting list, if they think things have changed. So we're encouraging our trust to approach it as these are still their patients, even though they're waiting a long time, because we know there's a big burden on primary care around these waits, which we've discussed before in our governing body. So our trusts are writing out to patients who've got longer waits than the statutory limits, which is a lot of patients, sadly, explaining to them to contact the trust themselves if they feel things have changed, and explaining to them what to do. So that is ongoing work that the trusts are doing, and we're monitoring that to make sure that that's happening. I guess what we'll be working with our primary care colleagues is to make sure that's working from a primary care point of view as well, because it's our GPs who'll see the problems with that if it isn't working, because our patients will go to general practice and tell them. So that's going to be ongoing, I think.
Thank you. I think Dan wanted to come in. Dan, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. That's really useful. I think my question, and I was pleased to hear that the 52-week wait list is coming down. I guess I'm just thinking, are we reassured that that's a true picture? Because I'm guessing this is relating to referrals that went in 1 year ago, which was basically during the pandemic. So we won't really know what the situation is until 52 weeks from now, when we're back up to our full kind of referrals into the various specialties. So is that something we can also track, if you see what I mean? So there's obviously a 52-week delay in terms of the real numbers of things, and we've had little people getting referred in 52 weeks ago because everyone was not really focusing on orthopedic issues, so or various other sort of elective issues. So do we get a flavour that the rate that we are clearing the backlog is not giving us false security, because the issue is going to be in 52 weeks time? If that makes any sort of sense.
Comment on that one, Sinead?
Yeah, because we've seen some really good graphs about the unmet demand that's probably still out there, haven't we, Neil? So yes, sure.
Yeah. In the planning process that as Sinead talked about, the Cheshire and Merseyside elective recovery group, in the planning assumptions, and we'll touch on some of them specifically around cancer in a minute, they have assumed an increase in referrals this year based on, so if we're now using 2019-20 as our baseline year for obvious reasons. We've skipped a year, and we're assuming that rates will be higher than they were that year because there's the catch-up effect. So that doesn't make the task any easier, of course, but at least it means the modelling assumptions are assuming something that is more realistic. So therefore, all the plans that we're developing are based on the fact there will be more referrals coming in, and it's not just suddenly go back to normal and forget that we had a massive dip last year. But you're right, there's almost a positive window at the moment, because we had a period where referrals were lower, but we know that they aren't at the moment. They've rocketed in the last couple of months, and they'll continue at that kind of level for however many months, we don't quite know, but for a period of time.
Thank you. Are there any final questions for that first section? If not, I'll hand back to Neil, Andy, and Sinead with a word on the timings. I think there are a number of further sections to come, and we are due to finish at 2:30. But 2 other items after this to address. I suspect we're probably going to need to run over a little bit, but ever so. So, any further questions on that, or I'll hand back to Neil to coordinate the next section.
Yeah, hopefully we've got Catherine to come in next. If we can move on to the cancer section, please. Just checking you there, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine, we can't hear you.
Right. Are you able to hear me?
No, Catherine.
Well, we can hear you very quietly. It's like you're in a different room.
You just shout.
Apologies, I'm not having great IT this morning. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's working. I can't hear. I wonder, Sinead, if you want to step in while Catherine sees if she can fix her.
I'll tell you what, Catherine, you can put it in the comments box if I'm getting anything wrong, and I'll whiz through these slides. It's very, Catherine's actually working today in practice. That's why she's having problems with her IT. She's not on a home computer, so I appreciate her trying to join us while she's trying to manage her clinical workload. So, okay, so this is cancer end of life and personalised care are another is a big important chunk of our thriving and prevention team's work. Catherine is our clinical lead who leads on these 3 areas. On cancer, obviously this links in very closely with the work I've just been talking about around elective care, restoration, COVID recovery, but also personalised care is a very important part of cancer care, and sustainable workforce. So there are issues around the cancer workforce which we're aware of and liaising with our providers around. End of life care, you've heard one of the reports around some end of life care work, transformational work that's been done. Person-centred care, incredibly important with end of life care. A lot of work around shared records, care home work around end of life care in care homes, and gosh, COVID really has focused our minds on that, all of us, and how important care homes are. Sustainable workforce and hospice sustainability, so we're doing a little bit of work with our network around hospice sustainability. And personalised care, there's a big NHS plan around personalised care, and we're working with that. Next slide, please. Thanks, Noreen. So obviously we want full operation of our cancer services back up and running, also bearing in mind what very important point Dan's made, that there's likely to be an increase in referrals. And in fact, if there wasn't an increase in referrals, we'd be quite worried actually, because we'd be worried about how many cancers we're missing. We are already anecdotally starting to see people coming in, some people coming in at a later stage than we would like with their cancer. So I think people have sort of sat on symptoms sadly during the first, second and third waves. So we need to get our cancer services fully up and functioning. Our 3 trusts have done pretty well at prioritising cancer patients during the last 14, 15 months. So I think they need to be commended on that. Sadly, there have been some breaches, you know, have not been able to meet the targets, but not. So yeah, we need to get back to no breaches at all, or no avoidable breaches, and bearing in mind the increase in referrals we're already seeing. Next slide, please, Noreen. So all of our trusts are doing well. I like those green arrows down. So all our 3 trusts are doing well with getting back to making sure they meet the targets with our patients. There are some that they're particularly challenged in, and they, to be honest, they were ones we were struggling with a little bit before COVID hit. It's not a surprise really, is it? So, but also the fact that with the gastrointestinal cancers, you need to do endoscopy, and endoscopy has been hugely hit by COVID because of the extra precautions you need to get put in place with doing that. But they're all improving every single week. The levels are higher, as we've said. Those are the pressure areas across Cheshire. So breast, gynecology, lower GI, we see across all 3 trusts actually, and skin. Everyone's struggling a little bit with skin. There's some particular issues with skin around the Countess that we're working on. They're changing their model of care a little bit as well to work closely with other providers. So that's adding a little bit of challenge in there. Diagnostics is the absolute key with cancer pathways, isn't it? And that, you know, we've really challenged around diagnostics during the pandemic and recovering. But I do think our trusts are doing well with this, with the support of CCG colleagues. Next slide, please. I think that might be the last slide. No. Yeah, mitigations. Yeah, to mention, we've got fit testing, which is about trying to decrease unnecessary endoscopies, basically, by doing this new test that you can do a sample on your poo, but if it's negative, you're very unlikely to have a GI cancer. So there's been a big programme of work to bring that in, and our secondary care colleagues are using it on their patients, and we're starting to use it on our patients in primary care now, as we're doing some work with the Countess around providing advice and guidance around cancer referrals, if required, for GPs to try and improve that process. Independent sector has been used a lot during the pandemic to help with us reaching our cancer targets, and we're continuing to do so. And we work really, really closely with our Cancer Alliance around all of this, and there's massive benefits with cancer pathways to working across provider alliances across Cheshire and Mersey and beyond, really. Next slide, please. So, bit of work around Action on Cancer. So Action on Cancer is our sort of public health work around trying to decrease the amount of cancer we have in Cheshire, and when people do have cancer, to get them to come to the GP or present much earlier. We've been doing that work for quite a few years before COVID hit, and we were starting to see some really, really good results. So much so the Cancer Alliance have picked this piece of work up to do across Cheshire and Mersey. So I do think that Cheshire is to be commended for that work, which really does see results probably a bit earlier than we thought. So we're absolutely picking that up again. It's been hard to run through COVID, been doing a little bit, but we're absolutely rolling with that work again, which is done very closely with our local authority colleagues and public health colleagues. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm just very aware of time, Andy. So I've scooted across, I've picked out some of the points again. The slides had a lot more on them. But I know there might be some questions. I don't know if Catherine's managed to still join us, but.
Are there anybody wanted to come in for questions on that section? I think Chris Lynch has typed a question into the sort of generic question really about disparities of rate of clearing across Cheshire and Mersey, and I think that is covered. So somebody wants to comment on that. He said essentially if one trust covers their waiting list sooner, it will exacerbate potentially postcode lotteries, inequalities, etc.
Yeah, I'll quickly respond. We're operating something which we call a single PTL, which is effectively a single waiting list principle across Cheshire and Merseyside, which would mean that providers should provide mutual aid to each other, which means if someone's going much quicker than someone else, they would try and put together to assist. Now, clearly, in an area as big as Cheshire and Merseyside, the real logistics of that are a bit more complicated than I make it sound, but the principle should help mitigate what you're talking about. And that's also the use of the independent sector would come in, that we could target some of the capacity in the private hospitals who supply NHS services to those areas which have got the longest or most challenging waiting lists to mitigate that. But I'm not going to sit here and say that we have a perfect solution that means there would be none of that, but we avoid it as much as possible through that Cheshire and Merseyside recovery approach.
Lovely, thank you very much. If there are no further questions on that section, can I pass back to you, Neil, in terms of moving on?
Yeah, it's now going to be Rebecca who's picking up urgent and emergency care.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Yeah, I'm on a dodgy laptop, okay. I will be brief. So we have the next slide, please. Okay, so this shows our current priorities in urgent and emergency care. Cheshire Health and Care System is working to deliver on 4 key priorities that you can see there. 3 of these relate specifically to maintaining quality of care and flow through the health and care system. They are obviously reducing demand on emergency care, improving flow through the acute hospital, and capitalising on the home first principles. We're going to do this with a renewed focus on the NHS 111 first model and the preferred options for the Integrated Clinical Assessment Service, otherwise known as CAS. The 4th priority, which you can see is the deep dive on the UEC data, is so that we can try and all work together to ensure we've got a better understanding of the demands placed in this area so that we can shape and flex the service offer accordingly as demands wane and wax. Next slide, please. So this shows our current position where you can see A&E performance is poor at the moment. The Countess is slightly better than Mid and East. All 3 A&Es have now submitted to NHSC improvement trajectories and recovery plans. As you can see, we have a higher than average long length of stay at the minute across all 3 hospitals and a high conversion to admission at the moment, which is down to the presentations at much of higher acuity and complexity than previously. The Home First model, which is being piloted at the moment, is now well established across Chester and has been supported by the National Emergency Discharge Fund. And in Cheshire, this model is now showing a sustained reduction in those length of stays despite the rise in acuity. And supports a view this approach really should be continued now and become business as usual. There's been a sharp rise in A&E attendances recently. One area highlighted is patients under 18 presenting with musculoskeletal problems. And the obvious area where there's been a significant spike is mental health presentations, and that's been across primary and secondary care. There is a national and local challenge regarding specialist mental health capacity, and the A&E Delivery Board have identified this as a significant risk now to patient safety and outcomes. Cheshire and Merseyside Health and Care Partnership have agreed to hold a mental health summit now to identify a whole system action plan to try and address this risk. Next slide, please. So this shows the timescales for this year that we're trying to work to. So March and April was spent reviewing the previous 12 months, agreeing what needed to continue, what needed to change. Plans have been developed now and implementation has been commenced, including the Home First Capacity Pilot. In May, we're going to focus on the evaluation of the Q1 plans and agree the approach to understanding what capacity we're going to need to achieve the 2-hour community crisis response. For the target for that is April 2022. And in June and July, we're going to be reporting on the Home First pilots with clear proposals for taking this model forward so it can be business as usual, alongside undertaking that modelling work about the community crisis response standard. Next slide, please. This shows the cost of delivering urgent and emergency care Q1 priorities across health and social care. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Neil, who's kindly agreed to explain this far better than I could.
Yes, thanks, Rebecca. So as Rebecca just touched on the previous slide, you'll recall back in March that the governing body approved an extension of a number of schemes around urgent emergency care into Q1, and we're doing the work evaluating the success of those schemes and the current status. As ever, coming out of a pandemic, some of the ground shifts. So if you take something like hot hubs, which are the primary care type assessment services we set up on the 3 hospital sites to cope with social distancing, we know that levels of activity are relatively low. Equally, at the moment, we know there's major concerns about the Indian variant and other variants I'm sure will come along to follow. And you then have to balance the shutting a service down versus the potential need to reopen it after a short period. But we're reasonably well on with that work. I guess the challenge we know is that we'll inevitably need to ask governing body to extend some of the schemes, not all of them, because the evaluation, as you can see at the bottom, is looking at the things we can now decommission confidently. the things that we need to retain for a little bit longer to continue the response. And I'll give you an example that you'll recall East Cheshire Trust removed their intermediate care unit off-site, and we commissioned a unit at the Western Park Care Home in Macclesfield. The unit that's on the East Cheshire Trust site is currently now a 30-bedded acute medical ward that is coping with the increase in admissions we've seen since the start of March following the release of lockdown and increased pressure on the system. So clearly our opportunity to move that unit back on site doesn't exist at present because it's being used for other pressures. So that's the approach we're taking. As I say, that the plan at the moment would be to come back to the June governing body, unless people suggest otherwise, in order to get approval for how we take that forward with those 3 categories at the bottom. Any questions for Rebecca or myself or others? No? Well, I think that then takes us on to mental health, and Tracy is going to lead on to these slides if Noreen, you can.
Can I just check, are there 2 more sections to go?
Yeah, urgent care and primary care.
Okay, we are really up against time now, so if people presenting could do so as succinctly as possible, please, that'd be helpful.
Thank you. So we are expecting and planning to take a deep dive on mental health through Strategic Commissioning Committee this month, with it coming to governing body next month. So with everybody's support, I propose that, because this is such an important area that affects vast numbers of patients and the public across Cheshire, that I skim over this now, not because it isn't important, but to give it the due attention next time. So the information that will come will build on what you have in front of you, splitting it down into 5 sections, and really majoring on how we have used our Cheshire investments and what we have achieved and what we are planning to do, but also focusing on the increased pressure that we are seeing on mental health services in all sectors of our provision, whether that's general practice, A&E, all sectors, and also outside of the health system and the wider determinants of health on that. So the way we've split it up also then covers what's happening at Cheshire and Merseyside level. I don't think I can do justice to this in the time that we have, Chair. So I think it would be better that we take what's here and also be aware that the Finance Committee is going to be reviewing the presentation under Linda's guidance, so that we also understand the money aspects of how we've used that commissioning investment. So I could go on, but I don't think we can do it justice in this time. So shall we leave those sections, and especially given that the deep dive will come back, or would you like me to continue?
No, I'm happy with that, but I would like to give the opportunity for colleagues to ask questions of what they've read in the slide pack, if there's anybody wishing to ask questions, and then I think we'll take your advice and come back to this in more detail. No, I can't see that anybody is specifically asking. So back to you, Neil.
Thank you.
Sorry, go on.
If there are specific requirements of governing body for that information that will come next time, please filter them through to me in advance so that we can make sure we cater for everybody's requirements. But a lot of work has been done already to prep for that. So thank you for that.
I'll hand straight to Andy McAlevey, who's going to pick up primary care.
Thank you, Neil. Are the slides still there or not? They are. So might I suggest, Chair, that we actually just spin through, everyone's had a look at the slides, and I appreciate that everybody on governing body, and I'm sure the public appreciate the input that primary care has had into the whole COVID pandemic. So huge input into the COVID related response and recovery, but part of that as well is the restoration and expansion of primary care. This has been an absolute need before the pandemic. During the pandemic, the response has been phenomenal. There has been some unfortunate communications this week, but there will be from NHS England, and I think it's for us as a CCG as well to support and understand the response that primary care has had. I think there's been enough information in the slide deck, Chair, to actually, take questions from this. And to just finish off the point of actually discussing this in governing body is to give governing body assurance and reassurance that the CCG, the executive, the teams behind it, and the clinical leads have got a grip on recovery. I've got a grip on getting the NHS and care back on an even keel, and I think that's part of it. It's challenging our providers to work better together. It's challenging with compassion. It's building on stronger relationships and having the structures in place as a CCG to understand from all of our providers where they're up to and providing that challenge in the right place, sensitive to the staff and how they're approaching recovery as well. We need to avoid the business as usual. It is a system-led recovery, but not go back to where we were in January 2020 and adopt as many new ways of working as we possibly can. Yeah, can I leave it at that? Apologies to primary care representatives if I thought I've not actually expanded on them, but in the interest of the meeting, I think we should end here.
Thank you, Andy. Are there any questions on that section, or indeed the wider section there? The idea of this section was to have a debate about recovery and to give the governing body the opportunity to give their input into and their sort of wide perspective and outside perspective on how the restoration recovery is being led and how it is going. I don't think we've quite achieved that because of the time constraints that we've come up against. So perhaps that's something we'll need to consider for a future date. But there is some time now for governing body to input if people wish to do that. So Claire? Oh, sorry, Paula was first and then Claire.
Thank you, Chair. My reflection when you read all the detail in the slides, and I've seen them a couple of times now, so and different reflections occur actually each time I read them, was actually about the link between many of these and actually making sure that the link between those different sectors that we've heard about stays. When you look at the slide around mental health and you look at the enormity and the scale of the programs within mental health, it's a challenge to almost separate it in that way. And I recognise we have to separate programs in some way to make sure we use specialist skills in terms of commissioners, in terms of service users who support us, and in terms of clinical experts as well. But there is something for me about strength that we need to keep as a CCG in terms of joining those programs up. And I think some of our program approach does that. And I think it's important that the board's governing body thinks about that. If you look at actually some of the other sectors that we've got, for example, just looking at primary care, the strength of the link there to the mental health programme. And I'm not sure that the slides necessarily exemplify the extent of the link between the programmes. And what I don't want to do is, as a CCG, to do possibly what pathways with clinicians we talk about sometimes, is where we want to work with people who then fall between criteria of pathways. And I'd like to make sure that as a CCG we're not part of trying to put things into neat boxes and remembering the diversity of pathways and comorbidities. I know all the clinicians on the call will completely recognise that point, but we need to make sure our programmes think in a comorbidity type of way as well, I would suggest. I think this presentation today has shown the strength of that. We need to make sure we never lose sight of that, I don't think.
Thank you, Paula. I think a point very well made. Claire and then Gwydion, and I think Chris is coming in, and then we will need to close because we are going to have time. We have got some more items, so brevity is helpful. Thank you.
Okay, very conscious of time. So firstly, thank you very much for all the work. I know an enormous amount has got into that. Really good in terms of clinical leadership, the work streams and the presentation. Interesting, I've made a point around sort of whole person. So I think it's similar-ish to Paula in terms of wrapping care around the individuals as opposed to working on a sort of a silo. I know it's not meant to be a silo basis, but I guess it's just maybe sometimes presentationally for ease it comes across like that rather than wrapping care around the whole person. I think it would be interesting maybe to think about quality improvement and how that drives efficiencies and vice versa. So maybe just something to think about as part of the transformation, whatever that term means, going forward. Health inequalities, I think we need to really focus on, differentially investing where the needs, they will differ, so one size doesn't fit all. And again, I know that work is going on, but it's just how we manage that through recovery and restoration of services when the national sort of framework probably doesn't allow that as easy as we would want to be doing. And welcome the deep dive next month on mental health. I think that would be really interesting, and I guess we just need to make sure we have sufficient time to give it due deference. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Claire. Dr. Rees.
Hi, thank you. I think it's just to draw attention to the short time we had for general practice. So I think there's a concern about the resilience of general practice. There's a big concern that Claire's highlighted about equality of opportunity. We need to invest in general practice. I think that's obvious. And general practice, like A&E, struggles because patients can access those services. So when they can't see someone else, they will try and access the service through their general practice. And they're not well placed to meet that need currently. And most of the mental health problem is washing up at the general practice's door. So it's just to make sure that the rest of the governing body are cognizant of that. I know Andy is, I know Sinead is, so that we can really look at that going forward. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Good. I think we'd all agree with that. Certainly the GP colleagues would. Chris, please, want to go in?
Yeah, just sort of building on Andy's point about not just trying to get back to where we were, and that working with local authorities, sort of ICPs, providers and partners, to really help build community assets, so that those community assets can, in some cases, in a lot of cases, be that first port of call to alleviate that pressure, on primary and then secondary. And it's in our so this year ahead, it's how to really, push that forward.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm just going to finish and summarise up by perhaps just reading out Peter's comment, which is to thank everybody for the team for presenting that, for the work that's going on, and because it has delivered significant assurance, I think, to the governing body about what has been happening, and that people are working in ways we need to see that they are doing. I think it does highlight the challenges and difficulties that we're all facing, but perhaps some of the opportunities there are to get things right for the population. But let's all be very honest, there are going to be challenges over many months to come as services are restored. Thank you very much for that. We are, I think we just asked to note that it was an area for debate. So I think we've had that. So thank you for that, and thank you again to the presenters. That moves us on to item 5.4, which is starts on page 66, which are the annual reports of the committees. We have a Finance Committee on page 66, the Primary Care Committee on page 77, and the Strategic Commissioning and Performance Committee on page 86. Each of those annual reports highlighting the work of the committee over the year. I'm simply going to do two things. Firstly, invite the chairs of those committees to make anything comments they wish to make, and then open it up to the rest of the governing body to ask any questions they have. So firstly, for the chairs of those committees, does anybody wish to highlight anything in particular for your annual report? No. Do any members of the governing body have any questions regarding those annual reports? I don't think we do. Thank you very much. So we thank the committees for those reports, which are noted and received. Thank you. And moves us to section 5.2.
Andy, sorry to disturb you. Claire had a hand up. I don't know if you saw.
All right, sorry, I didn't see. I was looking at the comments. Claire.
No, thank you. I guess firstly it was to thank the committee chairs. I think, despite, I'm never quite sure which one, the COVID pandemic, we have continued with the business of the organisation, and the committees have continued. So this is thanks this month and last month, because I know some of the annual reports came last month as well. it is really important in terms of our statutory duties that we continue. I know we, in terms of reducing the burden, we have sort of reduced the number of meetings and managed the agendas and the work differently. But I think it is really important in terms of both our sort of statutory accountabilities, our duty to the public, and also in terms of legacy and moving forward during this next 12 months, that the committees continue and the business does. So it was just to say thank you for the continued work, and thank you to the chairs of the committees.
I think we could all echo that, Claire. Let's all echo that. Thank you, chairs. Right, section 5.2, strategic commissioning. It's the Strategic Commissioning Committee terms of reference, page 97 of your pack. I'm not sure whether Wendy or Matthew is picking this up first. So either Wendy or Matthew, want to highlight those changes for us, please.
I can't necessarily talk to them, Andy. Other than that, I know they've gone to strategic commissioning. There's been lots of engagement in between the last meeting around amending the terms of reference, and this again fell out a lot of the governance review that we did late last year. I know, Wendy, you've been definitely more closely involved, as have some of the other members of the Strategic Commissioning Committee. So I think you want to further add to the proposed changes to the terms of reference?
No, I think they're very clear. Obviously, the terms of reference have taken out the performance element, and that's gone to quality. We've actually been looking at where some overlap with PCCC, because there are things which really we think that PCCC would benefit from understanding. So we've incorporated that the chairs between those committees will actually do that. I think we don't want duplication, so we wanted to make quite sure that our committees were not either duplicating or omitting where debate was actually required and would benefit a great deal. So we are attempting to make sure that that works very well. Apart from that, nothing else.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So I don't. Oh, Peter does have a question.
Yeah, sorry. It's only something which we probably need to draw to the attention of the governing body. There's a small change of membership effectively proposed in the membership section, which is a decision which is reserved to the governing body rather than the committee itself. So I just wanted to draw people's attention to that.
So thanks, Peter. I suppose by virtue of you agreeing the terms of reference, you're agreeing its membership. So, but you're right to draw attention to that. But again, the membership has been informed by the feedback that we've had. So, yeah, if you approve the terms of reference, you improve the membership.
Okay. I've got no further questions, so I'm assuming everybody has been able to study the new terms of references and is in agreement with it. And so we have to approve them. So if there's no dissent, we are approving them. Hicks hits hammer on table. Approved. Thank you. That moves us on then to 6.1, which is the forward planner on page 108. It's there for your information. I paused briefly to see if there's any comments upon the forward planner. Peter is our most consistent source of comments on the forward planner. No, he has no comments. Lovely. Okay, nobody else seems to be commenting. Thank you very much. That is the end of our business. I apologise that we are a few minutes over. I would remind members that we do have an informal meeting, which is on a Teams link following this. Can I suggest that we do that from 2:45 and only for 10 minutes as a way of just reflection and a quick catch up for those who are able to join us at 2:45. I understand that not everybody may be able to, because I know people have some further meetings. Thank you very much, and the meeting is closed.